self-cultivation. So a central Confucian concern is how to manage the world through personal self-cultivation. This presents a very serious dilemma for the Confucians. The choice to be engaged in politics or to detach from it, to try to advance in the political arena or to try to withdraw from any particular political engagement. You can even say self-cultivation is considered as a precondition for public service. This particular Confucian choice is quite unique in comparative religious or even comparative civilizational perspectives. The great utopian thinker in the West, perhaps as many of you know, Thomas More, in his Utopia, made a very interesting observation. If you want to engage yourself in the quest for inner spiritual purity, get out of politics, not to be involved in politics at all. If you don't want to get wet, don't go out in the rain. So politics is corruptive, politics is corrosive, disorienting. Once you get involved in politics, you will never be able to get out of it with a purity of heart or mind. So politics is considered an arena in which we should get out of. The notion of utopia is a vision of the world which is yet to come into being. So utopia actually means nowhere. It's certainly not here and now. But the utopian vision is a vision of a community that would yet to come, that will eventually emerge, which means the denial of the political arena here and now. Even the Greek thinkers, many Greek thinkers consider the contemplative mode of life much more important than actually engagement in praxis, in politics. So the life of the mind is not at all predicated on our ability to be involved in politics. To get out of politics, I think from the Greek point of view, is also important if you want to become a scholar, a scientist, or a philosopher. Max Weber, talking about the emergence of the modern world in terms of professionalization, particularly single out two arenas in the modern world that demand a great deal of attention for the intellectuals or intellectually minded people. One area is science, because science as a calling. Engage yourself in the scientific research or scholarship in general. The other one is politics. Involved in politics to redeem the world and to find meaning in life. So I would say what Max Weber presented to the modern world is the hard choice and the cold choice. The hard choice is involvement in politics. And the cold choice is detached from politics and engaged in the pursuit of scholarship. In all these conceptions, Thomas More, the Greek philosophical ideas of the contemplative mode of life, and of course Max Weber, politics is not congenial to self-cultivation or personal self-involvement or moral self-improvement. But the Confucians made a choice, an existential choice. First is a realistic appraisal of the situation, that is, politics is unavoidable. And then they also believe that politics as such is unacceptable, that this status quo is unacceptable. And yet it is possible to change politics. Now the belief, which is a paradox, many of us feel very difficult to accept it, but still it's a mode of persuasion. The belief is that changing ourselves could serve as a precondition for political reform or change in politics. You can actually change the meaning of being involved in politics. There's strong belief that self-cultivation in the world not as a quest for some kind of spirituality totally unrelated to the world. It's a political act. It can eventually be politically efficacious. The argument is not simply first try to cultivate yourself when you have accumulated enough inner resources, then you serve the public. Almost self-cultivation as a precondition. The assumption in practical terms is there's an interplay between your quest for self-understanding or spiritual self-transformation on the one hand and your engagement in the world through direct participation in politics. The strong belief, maybe even naive faith in the perfectibility of human nature is shared by all Confucians. Xunzi argued that human nature is evil, very much different from the mentioned belief that human nature is good. But he really believes that human nature is improvable. At least the human condition is improvable. You can say human nature, maybe in Xunzi, is somewhat fixed in the sense human nature is defined in terms of desires, strong desires. These strong desires can never be totally satisfied. So every human being is sometimes obsessed with various kinds of desires. Instead of appealing to the sensitivity of the heart and mind of all of us, including those who are in the political arena, like the kings, Xunzi, this is the mentioned approach, appeal to the sensitivity of the heart as the locus where the transformation of politics will become possible. Xunzi, as an empiricist, a rationalist, believes in a rational calculation. It's a pragmatic consideration. How to change politics does not depend upon the sensitivity of the heart and mind, but depend upon a rational calculus that will become eventually persuasive. First, to avoid danger, to establish a safety net for the survival of not only ourselves, but society as a whole, is predicated on the belief that each one of us probably know what is best, if not what is best for us, but what is necessary for us. In other words, Xunzi presupposes the intelligence of self-interest of each one of us. At least self-interest in the sense what is dangerous, what is precarious, what is a safety net, what is a proper way in a long-term perspective of human survival. But this idea of self-interest is not based upon an abstract rational principle. It's based upon a very concrete idea of reasonableness. What is reasonable, what is not reasonable. So his approach, even though he presupposes self-interest, his approach is very different from Adam Smith's idea of the self-interest. Adam Smith's idea of the self-interest is predicated on the function of the market. All of us, each one of us, has self-interest. Try to cultivate our self-interest, to maximize our self-interest according to a certain kind of rational principle in the marketplace. Eventually, the wealth of the nation will be enhanced through exchange, through the accumulation of self-interest, through the market mechanism, unintendedly, without any kind of true intention of anyone else, for the well-being of the society. The wealth of the society is greatly enhanced because the exchange in the marketplace, the maximization of self-interest, and the development of new goods and services enhances the wealth of the nation. But that's not a Xunzian argument at all. Xunzi's model is not the market. free exchange of ideas and goods and opinions. His model is an ordered and ordering government. In other words, he focuses attention on politics as the distribution of power and influence, and also as the management of the orderliness of the world. So he doesn't believe the Adam Smith idea that the invisible hand will help us to develop the wealth of the nation without anyone else, without anyone is interesting the process. In other words, all these are unintended consequences. Xunzi believes that you have to create a design, an organization, a structure, a long-term planning through negotiation, through thinking, in order to develop a reasonably just and fair society. Therefore, the emergence of a society that will be able to maintain security, eventually provide conditions for human flourishing, is a conscientious construction of the collective effort of all human beings involved. It's a collective enterprise. It's rather than unintended consequences of some invisible hand. In order to do that, it is important to recognize that human passions are extremely dangerous if they are not properly harmonized. Xunzi's project is based upon the harmonization of our passions as the proper way of ordering society. Disruptive passions include, of course, anger, jealousy, aggressiveness, possessiveness, obsessiveness. All these passions, from Xunzi's point of view, are natural. Each human being is endowed with all these passions. Because the scarcity principle, the goods in the world will never be able to satisfy the passions of the collectivity. If we allow our desires to express themselves, they will lead to larger desires. The consuming process will lead to higher level of consumption. There's no end to that process. It necessarily develops conflict, tension, and chaos. So how to harmonize passion becomes a major concern. Xunzi realistically believes that the two processes are important. One is the minimum requirement, which is law and punishment. Every society will have to develop its own law and punishment in order to maintain the minimum standards of social solidarity. But that would not necessarily lead to any kind of human flourishing. Therefore, it is also important to develop ritual. Ritual, in this sense, is invitational, inviting everyone to take part in a collective enterprise to harmonize their passions according to a higher good of the society. Negotiation, communication becomes necessary. And ritual can transform the minds of the people, even though laws are necessary for the maintenance of social order. So the precariousness of the human condition is that building this process, building a design, maintaining an organization, developing a structure is painfully difficult. And the destruction of that long process of accumulation is very easy. Sometimes it's instant. Therefore, it is important to mobilize all efforts in the society to develop this sense, the importance of orderliness, not just orderliness as a minimum requirement, but also society as a forum for exchange of ideas, eventually a society that provides conditions for human flourishing. So he is an environmentalist, not in a naturalistic sense, but also in the cultural sense. All the sensory gratifications of the human heart and mind, the way we see, the way we hear, the way we smell or taste, and how to place our four limbs, all this are important. The proper way of seeing, the proper way of hearing, the proper way of tasting, and so forth, all becomes important. Therefore, the right music, the right combination of colors, the right dwellings, the right roads, all these things that will help us to harmonize and cultivate our feelings and our emotions becomes politically significant. The institution of the family, the institution of the school, the institution of all kinds of local organizations in the village, in the province, in the county, and of course the central government in leadership. All of these social structures and political organizations will have to be mobilized. How values are transmitted in a society become absolutely critical. And yet he believes it's doable because intrinsic in the structure of the human mind, there's the ability to know this is right. Therefore, Xunzi redefines human nature. Human nature is the raw material. It's not evil in the sense intrinsic in all these instinctual demands and desires. There's some kind of positive evil. That's not his position at all. Even anger, jealousy, all these feelings are natural, human feelings. He's not a moralistic person in the sense that you have to overcome all these feelings. Not at all. They're fine. But these are the raw material for us to work with. If we do not work with this raw material correctly, we'll be in trouble, social disorder. To work with this raw material, we have one innate capacity that we can rely upon. That innate capacity is the cognitive function of the mind. The mind's ability to know, to differentiate. So the project, the Xunzian project in this sense, is to use the cognitive function of the mind or the knowing capacity of the mind to transform, harmonize our passion nature. This is in a way very familiar to us. Aristotle has some notion comparable to this. Every human being is a rational animal. And quite a number of other moral theorists in the West advocated the importance of rationality, human rationality, as the basis for the development of the moral person. But Xunzi has this conception of the mind. There are three defining characteristics of the mind. And every human being is endowed with this. Again, Xunzi believes in the egalitarianism of human nature and human heart and mind. The sages are exactly like us, with the same kind of passion nature, with the same kind of cognitive mind. The difference is that they manage to cultivate it in a more refined manner, so they will be able to harmonize not only their own emotions, they will be able to set examples for other people to follow. The first quality of the mind that Xunzi observed is that it has infinite capacity to store information. No matter how large the computer is, sometimes you have to enlarge its capacity to do it. But the mind seems to have the infinite resource to get new information, because the mind can also forget. The mind can also eliminate. So the mind is always, from his point of view, always empty. In other words, there's always room for further information. One capacity of the mind all of us is endowed with. Another capacity of the mind is its ability to integrate and synthesize, therefore to come up with a coherent picture of what all these bits of information really mean to us. In other words, the mind is able to unify and to make all these fragmented information into a coherent picture. You can have an image. Another marvelous capacity of the mind is its ability to maintain an equilibrium state in the dynamic process of transformation. The mind, in this sense, he uses the example of the water. When water is not flowing in a pond and it's not disturbed by any external force, the water will be able to reflect like a mirror. This is the capacity of the mind. The mind will be able to reflect all the images that come to the mind, not if it's properly cultivated, will not prejudge the various images. Because of the ability of the mind, each human being is endowed with the ability of the mind to store information continuously, to integrate them, to process them according to a coherent design, and also to remain tranquil in a very dynamic process of transformation. Each person can choose to become a cultivated person, even though our passion nature forces us to do all kinds of things against our rational understanding of social cohesiveness or social solidarity. But our mind intrinsically has the capacity to help us to make choice. For Xunzi, to make choice, to make distinction, becomes distinctively human. So the Xunzian idea of rightness is predicated on a conscious choice to follow a certain kind of path and to reject other possibilities. We have all these feelings and all these attractions, but we make critical choices. And these critical choices shape the general direction of our life. And he then designed a process of what that choice ought to be. The choice, of course, this is a Confucian choice, which is very different from the Buddhist or the Christian choice. The choice is to combine self-cultivation with public service. So the idea is to become not just a scholar, to become a scholar official, to become an engaged, concerned intellectual. The calling is not scholarship or science. The calling is the combination of the hot and cold, the combination of scholarship and politics. The idea is that because these qualities of mind, one should learn to deal with concrete affairs. Do not escape to the world of ideas or escape to the world of spiritual self-cultivation without being engaged. To deal with concrete affairs. To learn to become a teacher. The idea of a teacher is like a bell. If there's no question, the teacher should remain silent. If it is gently tapped, it will respond gently. If it is hit with tremendous force, then it will respond very loudly. Because the teacher has accumulated enough inner resources that it will be able to respond to the various kinds of concerns and questions, especially dealing with concrete affairs of the society. But teacher, from the Xunzian point of view, it's sometimes difficult for us to follow, is not at all in conflict with the bureaucrat. To be a teacher is to be a bureaucrat. In other words, to be an official, to be a magistrate, to be a secretary to certain kind of a socio-political organization, to be involved in the actual political process. And this is the meaning of being a leader. And of course, if the leader performs his or her function well, the leader will become an exemplar. An exemplar sets a standard of inspiration for the society as a whole. It is not enough to simply use the native intelligence that all of us have, even though the mind is capable of all these marvelous things. We have to go through a process of rigorous learning to train us to acquire enough cultural resources from the tradition as a cultural transmitter to engage ourselves in the trans-temporal communication. In other words, to communicate with the dead, with those people who are already not part of the living world. And this transmission, this kind of cultural resources is based upon the belief that through actively engage in the study of the classics, a person will become humanized. Xunzi, in this sense, privileged a type of learning as absolutely crucial not only for self-cultivation, but also for public service. This, of course, later very well developed in a number of modern projects, including the British civil service. That is, studying the classics is a way of not only training or disciplining yourself, but also provide enough cultural resources for you to become a good bureaucrat, a good leader, and even a good exemplar. So Xunzi, in our modern context, privileged a type of learning in the modern academy that we normally call humanities. What are humanities? Language, literature, history, philosophy, or religion. These are the subjects that considered by Xunzi absolutely crucial. We learn classics in order to acquire knowledge about the humanities. Now, the humanities, in this sense, represent the most intimate and relevant subjects of learning to human self-reflexivity. In other words, these are the subjects that help us to reflect upon our role in society as a human being. The most immediate and most relevant. Language is to help us to understand not only the tools of communication, how do we define ourselves, how we understand ourselves based upon our skillful use of the language. Literature is to study the most refined expressions of our harmonized feelings or our deep concerns and feelings. History is to study the collective memory which shapes our habits of the heart, our ways of life. Philosophy is to help us to think about our thinking. In other words, to think the rules and regulations that govern our thinking, to be, we call it second order reflexivity, to think about what we do in the most fundamental, question all the issues and in the most fundamental way. And of course, religion is to talk about our ultimate concerns. These subjects are the subjects of the humanistic learning in the modern sense, but these are the subjects of the classics. So in this sense, the classics, in fact, indicate the various kinds of humanistic visions that are embodied in the literature. But in order to do that, which means that we have to learn from the dead, from tradition. In order to do that, we have to learn the art of animating the old in order to attend the new. We have to bring the dead alive. So we have to learn to breathe vitality into the texts. We do not passively try to incorporate all these ideas into our daily life. We try to breathe vitality into the text. So we're actively engaged in the trans-temporal dialogue with the texts. Subjects such as aesthetics, ethics, or religious ideas are embodied in these texts, but they're totally meaningless to us if we cannot breathe vitality in the text by engaging ourselves in a continuous dialogue with these texts. And this is to help us to develop a historical consciousness, to have access to the collective memory that shapes the general direction, especially value direction of our society. History, in this sense, is a judgment. It's not just recorded, a record of what has already passed. It's a judgment. It's an alternative intelligence. Alternative intelligence in the sense that the most powerful political figures in the world today will have to be judged by another standard. That standard is not reducible to the arrangement of political power and influence here and now. The king may be the most powerful guy. And yet, in our collective memory, how the king eventually is being remembered is based upon our way of recording the deeds of the king. And therefore, the people who write history, the people who read history, develop an alternative intelligence in judging the criteria of the world. Remember, some most powerful, influential people in the time of Confucius, in the time of Mencius, in the time of Xunzi, and so forth. Numerous very powerful, influential people are totally forgotten, wiped out, clean in our collective memory. We do not know anything about them. And yet some of the people like Confucius, Mencius, and so forth, not very powerful, at the time not even very influential, continue to be part of our collective memory. They've gained certain kind of life where some of the most powerful kings and lords lost them. This is the power of history as collective memory. So history in this sense can develop immortality. There are three kinds of immortalities in classical Chinese thought. One is immortality because of virtue. One becomes an exemplar, then continue to exert some kind of influence throughout culture or history. The second one is immortality because of deeds, because some meritorious deeds, building canals, building roads, building social political structures, these major achievements of people lived through their institutions. The third one is writing books. And these books would be preserved and they continue to function in society through words. So through words, through deed, through your moral worth, you become immortal. So to become immortal in this sense is determined by the historical act, not necessarily determined by those who are really powerful and influential. So the most powerful may not be the most influential in the historical memory of a particular culture. In addition to this emphasis on tradition, on humanistic learning, classics, on the importance of historical consciousness, Xunzi is quite unique among early Confucian thinkers by placing a great deal of emphasis also on logic and the art of knowing an object. We call it epistemological issues. How to know an object. And he's very, very concerned about logical consistency and epistemological clarity. But his emphasis on logic is not what we normally associate logic, with mathematical calculation. In fact, a distinction has to be made. I just want to make one point. I don't have enough time to go into it. Margaret Mead, who's a very important anthropologist, once made an observation concerning two types of knowing, two types of learning in the modern academic context. One is called the digital mind, the digital process. Computer is a good example, but mathematics. The other one is pattern recognition. The idea of pattern recognition is related to what Margaret Mead would call anthropological knowing. So you have two types of knowing. One is the mathematical, computational mode of knowing. The other one is anthropological mode of knowing. In the mathematical, normally we call it logic mode of knowing, it's digital, therefore it's linear. From A to B to C to D. If you say from A to C, then immediately say what happens to B. If you say from A to D, what happens to B and C. You have to have a very clear notion about the movement from the first step to the second step and so forth. Pattern recognition requires your ability to endure ambiguity. For example, if you never visited Harvard Yard or Harvard Square, better example. So you visit Harvard Square. First visit Harvard Square, you got some kind of general impression, like an anthropologist who's going to do the field work. So you jot down your general impression. That's a pattern. But after you visit the place a number of times, after you become senior, you visit it numerous times, you have a very different vision, idea of Harvard Square. And that idea, that pattern emerges out of a great deal of thinking, reflecting, refining. So that pattern recognition is anthropological, as opposed to digital thinking. What Xunzi is trying to say, logic and epistemological clarity are all related to the anthropological pattern recognition. Therefore, he's interested in classification, interested in rectification of names, interested in the proper image that we'll be able to derive in our understanding of human relationships, of the various kinds of things that derived from various kinds of sources of information. What is implied in this process then is the need for the cumulative effort of the individual, of small communities, of the nation as a whole, the mobilization of all these resources to develop a humane society. And all these efforts will have to be put together in a coordinated way. It's certainly not personal, but it could be profoundly meaningful for each and every person involved in that process. It is a communal. A society that seems to have accumulated a great deal of this kind of knowledge, this kind of understanding, this kind of ritual, is a society in modern terms that has accumulated a great deal of social capital and cultural competence. So we can imagine what Xunzi is trying to suggest is that through the learning of the classics as a collective enterprise, we gradually transform a society from simply, or politics, simply as a mode of the distribution of wealth, power, influence, status, to a society that exhibits communication and collaboration. A society that has all kinds of horizontal as well as vertical communication. The society is vibrant because the people in the society are willing to engage themselves in a continuous conversation. This reminds me, I try to find an example to illustrate what kind of society we're talking about that's envisioned by Xunzi in terms of the cumulative effort. And of course, there are many, many examples in Confucian literature, but I find an example in the Buddhist literature concerning Sakyamuni is most illustrative. Sakyamuni, of course, is the Buddha. He, at one point, was confronted by a series of inquirers. Some of the people from one society are involved in the preparation for the invasion of another society called Vajians. The Magadas are willing to invade the Vajians. And Shakyamuni asked a series of questions, basically 7 questions, about the Vajians. And these questions eventually are understood in the Buddhist literature as reasons that a society will not decline. He said, if I ask these questions, if the answers to all these questions turn out to be positive, then even if you try to invade a society, you're not going to conquer it at all. Now, these are the questions in the Buddhist literature. Do they value discussion and dialogue in the society? Do they value cooperation and solidarity? Do they value laws and traditions? Do they respect their elders? Do they respect children and women? Do they respect religion and spirituality? Do they value people of culture and learning, whether they be Vajians, be natives or not? Are they open to such influences from abroad? These are very simple, not simple-minded, very simple questions. We can ask ourselves about our own community, about our own society, to test what Xunzian would call whether the society has embodied a great deal of social capital or cultural competence. Now, society that will be able to respond all positively to these questions turn out to be a society that has a different politics. The politics in the society is not defined in terms of domination and control alone. Of course, politics always mean that. But it opens up to other possibilities. And if the answer to the value of discussion and dialogue, cooperation and solidarity, laws, traditions, respect the elders or respect children and women, and so forth, are all in the positive, which means a cultural test. The people in the society have access to classical learning, they have historical consciousness, they have a sense of communication, a sense of human flourishing, not simply defined in terms of wealth and power. Now, it is in this sense, I think, what Xunzi is trying to do concerning politics. The classical question, of course, how can individuals, through self-cultivation, that will be able to transform society through the public service? If politics is corruptive, you have to get out of politics. This is what Thomas More suggests. Then the option is to create a spiritual sanctuary, to create a world that is meaningful outside of politics, in the privacy of your home, in the church, in the afterlife, or in some kind of ecstatic domains that politics will not be able to invade. In other words, to enlarge the private domain. That normally, from the Confucian point of view, cannot be done. Politics is all pervasive. So the better choice is to confront politics and try to transform it from within. Now, the transformation will have to be based upon the faith that eventually the society is no longer simply defined in terms of wealth and power. The society also a forum, an environment for human flourishing. So the idea is to develop an environment for human flourishing, rather than simply to develop an environment which will maintain security. Security is only the minimum requirement. Now, what kind of human flourishing people like Xunzi actually envision? I think in this sense, his position may not be very different from Mencius. In one area that I was not able to get into when we discussed Mencius, concerning the 6 stages of human flourishing in Mencius, maybe we go through this briefly to see whether the mentioned idea of human flourishing is at all compatible with Xunzi. Mencius believed that we can, each and every human being can begin with simply the effort to try to be good. Now, in moral reasoning, most of the moral reasoning courses, the emphasis is to say, if we can be good, we've already achieved the goal. The society will be harmonized, and the maintenance of social order will no longer present a major problem. But human flourishing, either in the Greek sense or in the Confucian sense, is to take good as the beginning point. We, of course, want to be good. The desirable is good. We could become desirable companion. We're not presenting any threat to others. This is good. To have it in oneself is true. Not only being desirable, but there's some inner resources that we have which makes us substantial rather than simply just pleasing, simply good and desirable. That is called true. To possess it fully in oneself is called beautiful. A beautiful person is not only the person who has some inner resources, but the inner resources are abundant. Therefore, it can shine forth. But to shine forth with this full possession, shine forth brilliantly the inner resources that one embodies, it's called great. So a person who is only desirable is a good person, but only a person who has self-knowledge, has some kind of inner content to the person's personality, will the person be called true, a true person. And if the inner quality is abundant, the person becomes a beautiful person. If shines forth brilliantly, it becomes a great person. To be great and be transformed by this greatness is called sage. A sage is a person who is not only great, but the greatness of the sage is being transformed continuously, but also is transforming, meaning transforming the society. To be sage and to transcend the understanding, it becomes mysterious. We don't know how the transformative work actually functions in society. Then we call it divine. We call it spiritual. So a person, in a sense, what Xunzi envisions, I don't think it's at all in conflict with Mencius, is an environment in which not only we become good, but then through goodness we become true, become beautiful, become great, become sagely, and eventually become spiritual. This sense of human flourishing is really the goal of society. Society, not simply the mobilizing all these resources, not simply to maintain order, maintain security, but also to provide an opportunity for the full flourishing of self-cultivation. So in this sense, then politics can either be a most dangerous threat to human flourishing, self-cultivation, or politics can be the proper arena in which self-cultivation becomes not only possible, becomes even authenticated. And this requires endurance. Now you have a grandiose idea, to be sure, idea of harmonizing society, of moralizing society. That grandiose idea may never be fully realized, but you have this grandiose idea, and then the ultimate concern is to develop what the Confucians, Xunzi in particular, calls the steadfastness of purpose. The ultimate concern of a Confucian as a bureaucrat, as a leader, as a scholar official, is to see to it this particular humanistic vision, grandiose vision, be realized. You can even say, use Max Weber's idea, this becomes the Confucian calling. This calling requires a sense of endurance. Endurance meaning, this is related to the earlier Confucian idea that he knows it cannot be done, and yet he cannot but do it. So realistically, they're all aware of the fact that this ideal, either for themselves or for society as a whole, can never be fully realized because all the constraints. And yet they cannot but do it because there's no choice. They're in the world, they're part of the society, and they're not going to create other kind of arenas. Let me end with a simple statement. I don't have time to go into the ritualization issue now. It's a simple statement in the Great Learning. We'll have a chance to read that text later, which actually grew out of the whole Xunzian idea. Many people say the Great Learning is probably closer to Xunzi's tradition than to the Mencian tradition. In the Great Learning, it starts with the argument that self-cultivation is the basis for the regulation of family. The regulation of family is the basis for the governance of the states. And the governance of the states is the basis for peace in the world. So self-cultivation then is a basis through which, on which family solidarity can be established. And family solidarity becomes the basis for social harmony, and social harmony becomes the basis for the governance of the states, peace in the world. But self-cultivation is not simply the task of ministers, of scholar officials alone. Self-cultivation has to be the task of the political leaders as well as the general populace. So the argument is that from the king, from the ruler to the commoner, each and every one will have to regard self-cultivation as the root, in the sense that no matter what you do, no matter where you are, no matter what your position is, self-cultivation becomes important as your intellectual, spiritual self-definition, also as the way through which a political order can become moral.